because the humanitarian situation remains dire. Cancer patients say they're being denied.
Suppose you're on your way to work and see your friends Peter and Nick in a fight. Peter says he punched Nick after Nick slapped him. Nick says he slapped Peter only after Peter had insulted him. Peter says he only insulted Nick because Nick stole one of Peter's items. This goes on for a while. At this point, you would probably investigate what the first trigger point was and work from there. It would not really make sense to just give up and think this is all a never-ending cycle of violence between these two people that will never really end. If you end up finding out that the first trigger was that Peter wanted to humiliate Nick and so pushed him off stage when Nick was giving a presentation, you would question Peter on what was the reason for this action and seek to get him to apologise and rectify the situation. Whilst it might seem obvious what the correct position should be taken on this course, unfortunately few take it upon themselves to understand and apply this rationale with many other situations across history, namely the Israel-Palestine conflict. And after over 6 months of reading books, papers, articles and interviews, here is the answer. The Arab-Israeli conflict is not, contrary to popular belief, entrenched in a 1,000-year battle between religions, but it begins in 1896 in a response to centuries of European anti-Semitism. For centuries, religious and state laws were set up to subjugate Jews and their liberty, preventing them from owning land and holding public office. Guilds excluded Jews from most occupations, forcing them into pursuits like money lending, trade, and commerce. Excluded from Christian society, Jews maintained their religious and social customs. They were blamed for events such as the spread of leprosy or the Great Plague, with claims that they poisoned the wells. This all led to waves of expulsions from Western European countries over time between the 10th and 14th centuries, leading them to settle in Eastern Europe. Before we begin, we must ask ourselves, what is a Jew? What is a Palestinian? What is an Arab? People might be confused at the distinction between these two terms, one perceived as a religious group and one as an ethnicity, intertwined with language and culture, but it is not so simple. Some people make the claim that the name Palestine was given by the Romans to the Jews at the time as a demeaning or insulting name following the Bar Kokhba revolution in the 2nd century CE.
130 to 136 CE, there is a massive revolt by the Jews under a general named Shimon Bar Kokhba, Simon Bar Kokhba. The Bar Kokhba revolt was extremely damaging to the Roman Empire. They had to expend extraordinary resources in order to stop the Bar Kokhba revolt, which is why it was almost an independent kingdom for a solid 4 or 5 years there. They renamed the area Palestine as an insult to the Jews. That's why it was named Palestine. So when people say historic Palestine, understand that the existence of Palestine was meant as a name, as an insult to the Jews, who were considered the historic inhabitants of the land, and it is first used in 136 CE, a solid 1,200 years after the Jews first enter the land at a minimum.
However, this does not seem to check out, as the words Palestine occurs in the works of Greek historian Herodotus, who talks about sitting on the banks of Palestine, and refers to the people as the Syrians of Palestine. The Romans also referred to the region interchangeably between Judea and Syria Palestina, as mentioned in the works of Gaius Plinius, Flavius Josephus, or Philo of Alexandria, whom all lived a century before the Bar Kokhba revolution. It is difficult to pin down precisely when Palestinian was coined as an identity. Some historians note it down to the mid to late 19th century, with the emergence of nationalism and the creation of new national identities, while some place it earlier to the 1834 Peasants' Revolt in Palestine. Some historians go even further and place the place of origin in the 17th century. Now, what is a Jew? Oxford Dictionary defines a Jew as a member of the people and cultural community whose traditional religion is Judaism, and who trace their origins through the ancient Hebrew people of Israel to Abraham. So we can see how the term is used not just as a religious term, but to describe an ethnic group too. This is how claims are made that 20% of Israelis are Arab, or how there is a distinction between Israeli Arabs and Israeli Jews. They are not one and the same. The comparable label to an Israeli would be something like an American, Turk, or even a Palestinian nationality, whereas a Jew is comparable to an Arab, Punjabi, Han Chinese, or Caucasian. After seeing Jewish persecution on the continent for centuries, particularly frightened by the new rising waves of anti-Semitism following the Dreyfus affair, a Jewish Austro-Hungarian man by the name of Theodor Herzl, known as the father of modern Zionism, expressed his philosophy in his book Der Judenstaat, or the Jewish State. Herzl argued that only a state for and run by Jews would ensure their safety, and plans of the location and details followed in the First Zionist Conference of 1897 in Basel, Switzerland. The precise location of said state would move around from Alaska to Argentina, from Zimbabwe, then on to British East Africa, land in what is now modern-day Kenya. The British Empire did offer an uninhabited plot of 6,000 square miles to Herzl. The Zionist Congress was very close to accepting it, with others still unhappy with the location. However, the European settlers who had already laid claim to that colony were unhappy to let it go and refused, leading the Zionist lobby to look elsewhere. Palestine was always looked at as an option, as it was seen as a historic link to the ancient tribes of Israel and Judea thousands of years back. Herzl did not care. He was an ardent secularist and an atheist, but utilized the argument as it appealed to a lot of anti-Semitic Christian revisionists who both wanted to get rid of the problem of European Jewry once and for all, as well as fulfill the biblical prophecies linked to the return of the Jews. In 1896, whilst on a trip to Istanbul, Herzl pleaded with Sultan Abdulhamid II for the sovereignty of the state of Palestine as a homeland for the Jewish people, citing massive debt alleviances for the empire, but was rejected out of court, with the Sultan famously saying, "I cannot sell even a foot of land, for it does not belong to me, but to my people. My people have won this empire by fighting for it with their blood, and we have fertilized it with their blood. We will again cover it with our blood before we allow it to be wrestled away from us." It is important to note that Herzl never really saw himself as an ardent religious Jew, nor fond of his heritage or his ancestry leading back to the Middle East. Born to an affluent Austro-Hungarian family, he was fluent in French and German, but had no grasp of Hebrew or Yiddish. In his memoirs, he expressed his feeling unimpressiveness after visiting Jerusalem, thinking it to be dirty and not up to Western standards, and was not fond of the Arab religion found there. He saw this move of Zionism back to their quote-unquote ancient homeland as a means of necessity in order to fight off European anti-Semitism, and hoped to gain the respect and sympathy of the European colonizing powers at the time. Zionism was an explicitly self-described colonial project, with Herzl famously writing, "Without colonialism, Zionism is nothing but a castle in the air." In another book entry, "We should there form a portion of a rampart of Europe against Asia, an outpost of civilization as opposed to barbarism. The bride is beautiful," he writes in his diary, "but she's married to another man," referring to Palestine. Future Prime Minister and key Zionist figure David Ben Gurion had also stated, "Palestine is grossly underpopulated. It contains vast colonization potential, which the Arabs neither need nor are qualified." As Zionist leader, soldier, and poet Ze'ev Jabotinsky said, "Every native population in the world resists colonists as long as it has the slightest hope of being able to rid itself of the danger of being colonized." Following that with, "Zionist colonization must either stop or else proceed regardless of the native population." As far back as 1895, Theodor Herzl wrote, "We must expropriate gently the private property on the state assigned to us. We shall try to spirit the penniless population across the border by procuring employment for it in the transit countries, while denying it employment in our country. Both the process of expropriation and the removal of the poor must be carried out discreetly and circumspectly. Let the owners of the immovable property believe that they are cheating us, selling us things for more than they are worth, but we are not going to sell them anything back." A key aspect stressed about settler colonialism is population transfer, as the main obstacle standing in the way of the settler community is the indigenous population. They do not wish to go back to their metropole, Israeli historian Ilian Pape suggests, such as is the case in Canada, Australia, or America. Hence, the insistence on claiming the new territory as their own. Population transfer is described under deportation or forcible transfer of population, which is defined as a crime against humanity under the Rome Statute of the Treaty of Rome by the International Criminal Court. And population transfers are also encompassed under definitions of ethnic cleansing. In 1937, in the 20th Zionist Conference, David Ben Gurion said, "You are no doubt aware of the Jewish National Fund's activity in this respect. Now, a transfer of a completely different scope will have to be carried out. In many parts of the country, new settlements will not be possible without transferring Arab fellaheen." He concluded, "Jewish power in Palestine, which grows steadily, will also increase our possibilities to carry out this transfer on a large scale." And in a 1938 meeting for Jewish Agency, David Ben Gurion said, "I support compulsory transfer. I don't see anything immoral in it." And also in a letter to his son in 1937, Ben Gurion also said, "We must expel Arabs and take their place. Up to now, all our aspirations have been based on an assumption, one that has been vindicated through our activities in the country." The expressed goal of Zionism was always to have a Jewish majority state and push past its borders to realize the goal of a complete Israel, with some calling for a greater Israel, a movement which was once suppressed by the government due to its undiplomatic nature of invading neighboring sovereign nations. However, an increasing number of Israeli politicians are openly supporting these plans, such as the main Likud party, whose charter calls for full Israel between the river and the sea. Many more examples can be cited. such as the current finance minister, Bezalel Smotrich, giving a speech with the map of Greater Israel on the podium, showing the map of Israel extended between the Euphrates and the Nile, with borders extending down to Mecca and Medina. This would mean the aspiration of a Greater Israel would involve invading Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Jordan, the West Bank, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt. Joseph Weitz, known as the architect of transfer for his role in purchasing Palestinian land and kicking Palestinians off, said in 1940, "It must be clear that there is no room in the country for both Arab and Jewish peoples. There is no way besides transferring the Arabs from here to the neighbouring countries, and to transfer all of them. Not one village must be left, not one tribe. And only after this transfer will the country be able to absorb millions of our brothers, and the Jewish problem will cease to exist. There is no other solution." The early pre-European Jewish community in Palestine and the Ottoman Empire were mainly made up of religious and Mizrahi Jews, who either were not Zionists or were anti-Zionist themselves. Jabotinsky wrote in 1925, "If you wish to colonize a land in which people are already living, you must find a garrison for the land or find a benefactor who will provide a garrison on your behalf. Zionism is a colonizing venture, and therefore it stands or falls on the question of armed forces. It is important to build. It is important to speak Hebrew. But, unfortunately, it is even more important to be able to shoot, or else I am through with the playing at colonization." Israeli historian Yaakov Shavit of Tel Aviv University says that Zionism was a 19th century project in the 20th century, a movement that arose as an offshoot of European nationalism and colonialism. European Jewish migration began in the early 20th century. It began with the purchasing of land off of idle absentee Palestinian landowners and farmers in large swaths, kicking the indigenous Palestinian population out and sending European settlers in their place to create isolated, exclusive settlements. The Jewish National Fund was set up in 1901 with the express purpose of trying to purchase land in the Ottoman Empire and to create Jewish settlements there, which received donations from Jews all over Europe. In comparison, the Arab National Fund was only allowed by the British to be set up in 1944 and raised about $700,000, an impressive feat, but which paled in comparison to the Jewish National Fund, which was raising about $4 million annually, largely from wealthy American donors at that point, all used to progress the colonization of Palestinian land. When the news about the amount the Palestinians were able to raise got released to the press in 1947, the next day news broke out of a Jewish widow living in South Africa donating $4 million to the Jewish National Fund, the equivalent of around $60 million today, all to be used exclusively for the benefit of the Jewish people, as outlined in their charter. The British saw a unique opportunity in their ability to exploit different groups' desires and their own. Lord Arthur Balfour, a Prime Minister of Great Britain and soon to be the Foreign Secretary, came to the rescue. He was especially hated in Ireland, Britain's oldest colony, being labelled with the nickname Bloody Balfour. It was in Ireland, which the British had seen much resistance over the years after their bloody actions on the island, and had presided over the deliberate starvation in the Irish potato famine. Ironically, it was his government that authored the 1905 Aliens Act, primarily trying to keep fleeing Jewish refugees from Tsarist Russia out of Britain. The British issued the Contradictory Promises, a series of different promises to different parties meant to align their support with British interests, first to the Arabs, then the Zionists, then the French. In what is now known as the Hussein-McMahon Correspondence, Great Britain had made many promises to the Arabs in the wake of World War I, to the Arabs enticing them with the idea of a free, united Arab state, even designing a flag for them, in return for Arab support in fighting against the Ottoman Empire. "I'm authorized to give you the following pledges on behalf of the government of Great Britain, and to reply as follows to your note. That subject to the modifications stated above, Great Britain is prepared to recognize and uphold the independence of the Arabs in all the regions lying within the frontiers proposed by the Sharif of Mecca." Only the Palestinians were consistently denied these rights after fighting more than any other colony, and still continue to this day. British officials tried to explain that Mandate Palestine was excluded from these promises of self-determination. However, when extracts of the Hussein-McMahon Correspondence was released in 1938, the British government had to accept the deceit and admit the language they used was purposefully vague. Despite every promise and occupied people in the Arab sphere and elsewhere eventually being granted the right to self-determination, it was fought for after many bloody wars and decades, with the occupying powers, Britain and France, changing their agreements, twisting their words, or just plain lying in order to remain in power, and only left when it was no longer possible to continue the grip on the region, as it happened in Kenya, Algeria, India, French Indochina, and many other colonies. All that time, they ensured dependencies from the colonies to the mother nation, and left the borders in such a disarray in order to ensure instability between peoples of different ethnicities religions, languages, and cultures. Britain had also promised in Palestine a national homeland for the Jewish people, as outlined in the 1917 Balfour Declaration. This was caused by a few reasons, such as wanting to limit Jewish immigration to Britain, wanting to return the Israelites to their quote-unquote original homeland in the Bible, and largely for the anti-Semitic trope that, quote-unquote, the Jew had the power to keep Soviet Russia in the war against Germany, as it was looking unlikely that post-revolution Russia would remain in the war, as well as trying to bring in the United States into the war. There has always been a great interest in having an outpost for the British in the region, just as the French saw with Lebanon, in order to secure the control over the region as it was quickly being seen as an oil-rich region. Mainly, they wanted to secure the Suez Canal's stability and ensure a presence in its east, in order to patrol the trade and sea passage route on the way to the empire's crown jewel, India. The declaration stated that His Majesty's government view with favour the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, with its wording being kept purposefully vague, and later claiming it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of non-existing Jewish communities in Palestine. In short, one people promising a second people the land of a third. In a memorandum in 1919, Balfour said, "In Palestine we do not propose even to go through the form of consulting the wishes of the present inhabitants of the country. The four great powers are committed to Zionism, and Zionism, be it right or wrong, is more important than the wishes of 700,000 Arabs. What I have never been able to understand is how it can be harmonized with the declaration, the covenant, or the instructions to the Commission of Inquiry. I do not think that Zionism will hurt the Arabs, but they will never say they want it. Whatever be the future of Palestine, it is not now an independent nation, nor is it on the way to become one." The final plan, the Sykes-Picot Agreement, was what was initially implemented, which suggested carving up the Arab states into French and British colonies, contrary to what was promised to the Arabs prior. A highly secret document, known only to the public due to the Bolsheviks leaking said plans after the revolution in 1917, caused outrage in the Arab world. The plan was only known by its drafters, Sir Mark Sykes and Francois-Georges Picot, and a small handful of elite British and French officials, exposing the deceit to the Arabs. Censorship was rampant, and the Allied forces landed in Jerusalem and banned any spread of the Balfour Declaration, either by word of mouth or by the press. This led to those residing in Damascus, which had not yet had any restrictions to their news coverage, to send a letter of protest to the peace treaty signing in Versailles, claiming that Palestine was their country, not one to hand over to the European Zionists, especially at a time when the Jewish minority amounted to just 6% of the total Palestinian population. Starting after World War I, large-scale Jewish settlers began flocking to what was now to become British Mandate Palestine, who helped them build up the first mock of the Zionist state. A separate Jewish-owned economy was created, linking Jewish business and consumers with exclusively supplied Jewish labour. Arabs were to be discriminated against and barred completely, avoda ifrit as they say, with injections of massive amounts of capital from abroad. By the mid-1930s, despite Jews still making up a minority of the population, this economic sector became bigger than the Arab sector. We are not dealing with the wishes of an existing community, but are consciously seeking to reconstitute a new community and definitely building for a numerical majority in the future. He has great difficulty in seeing how the president can possibly reconcile his adherence to Zionism with any doctrine of self-determination. Prime Minister Lloyd George, Foreign Minister Arthur Balfour, and Secretary of State Churchill all promised Chaim Weizmann that by the term Jewish home, they meant eventual Jewish state, and would therefore prevent the establishment of a representative government in Palestine, and even appointed former Cabinet Minister Sir Herbert Samuel as British High Commissioner in 1920, a committed Zionist. Colonial Secretary Winston Churchill, responsible for Palestine, was also present at the meeting when Lloyd George tells Churchill that we must not allow such a thing as representative government to happen in Palestine. In 1919, the former British Viceroy for India and the current Foreign Secretary Lord Curzon told Balfour, warning him, Weizmann contemplates a Jewish state, a Jewish nation, a subordinate population of Arabs, and that Weizmann was trying to effect his behind the screen and under the shelter of British trusteeship. It had always been apparent to the native Palestinians what the objective of Zionism was, as shown with the many quotes from key Zionist figures, as it was advertised internationally and in Hebrew as well. A national homeland for Jews where they could constitute the majority of the population via land transfers, evictions, and building up political power to be able to ethnically cleanse them. More and more European Jewish paramilitary groups started forming, and breaking out into violent skirmishes with the local villagers. The leaders themselves made it no secret either. In an interview in 2018, world-renowned Israeli historian Ilan Pappé said,
as Ben Gurion stated very clearly, even openly, not just in secret documents, he stated we can never have a viable Jewish state within what the United Nations accorded to us. And the reason was that according to the United Nations, the part that was accorded to the Jewish state had an equal number of Jews and Palestinians in it. And also
something like 51 to 49%. Yeah.
And also he said the borders are not viable. But he said it doesn't matter because the Palestinians in the Arab world rejected it. What will determine, he says very clearly.
And we have explicit written documentation.
Oh yeah. But as I said, this was not even secret documents. These are his speeches in front of Mapai, the major party, in which he says we will need to have at least a population where we are 80% of the population, not 60-40, not 40-40, 80%, and we need 80% of the land if we want to have a viable state. He's very clear about it.
80% of the land being 80% of
mandatory Palestine.
Mandatory Palestine, excluding Transjordan.
Yeah, which is very interesting because the Zionist movement gave the United Nations, when they started their deliberations, they gave them a map. And in the map, they offered that the Jewish state would be 80% of Palestine, which is Israel today without the West Bank. Very interesting. The United Nations thought it was too much to give the 1/3 of the population, most of them immigrants who came a few years before, to give them 80% was a bit too, even they thought it was a bit too much, so they offered them more or less half of the country.
Several Palestinian Arab congresses were set up with delegates from Muslim and Christian societies lobbying for Arab independence, rejection of the Balfour Declaration, support for majority rule, ending unlimited Jewish immigration and land purchases. However, their claims fell on deaf ears and little progress was ever made. Several international claims and addresses were made that showed clearly how little the voices of the Palestinians were being taken, such as when the League of Nations issued the mandate for Palestine, enshrining not just the Balfour Declaration verbatim, but also going even further, with referencing Article 22 of the Covenant of the League of Nations, which recognizes a people's right to self-determination on the international stage to just the Jewish people, with the words Arab or Palestinian not even being mentioned once in the entire charter, wiping out 2,000 years in history, religion, and culture in one swipe. 7 of the mandate's 28 articles are entirely devoted to the privileges and facilities extended to the Zionist movement in order to implement a national home. Official representation was granted to the Jewish minority in accordance to Article 2 of the mandate. However, it was made clear that this article would apply only to the Jewish minority, whilst the Palestinian majority made several claims to official representation but were consistently rejected. Any further concessions were made contingent on equal representation with any Jewish parties, despite still holding the overwhelming majority of the population. Article 4 of the mandate gave the official Jewish delegation, which did not include any aforementioned Mizrahi or non-Zionist Jews, official governmental powers and privileges, ranging from the economic and social spheres to development of the country. It also granted official international diplomatic status, an act only granted to official sovereign nation states, which further allowed it to lobby its interests in front of the League of Nations, all whilst the Palestinians were still being denied basic representative rights. This body was also given further powers to run an education system entirely in Hebrew with their own curriculum, with the Zionist agency running control of the democratic representation, health, and public infrastructure, in addition to international diplomacy and education. They made Hebrew the official language, essentially allowing for a separate Zionist government to be set up in tandem with the British mandate, with the only thing separating it and an official sovereign entity being a military wing. Article 6 granted the mandate the power to facilitate any Jewish immigration and to push for closer Jewish settlements with exclusive racialized communities. Article 7 was used to grant European Jews citizenship in Palestine. However, the same article was also used to bar Palestinians who had fled the Ottoman Empire to other countries during the war and wanted to return to their homeland. The Jewish immigrants were allowed to gain nationality independent of where they were born, raised, or however many centuries their families had roots in a certain countries, a law we still see to this day with the Jewish right of return law. But a native Palestinian family which had fled just before the British mandate was established were banned from re-entering or receiving nationality. As more time passed, the Palestinians would end up seeing Jewish immigration, land purchases, and evictions only get worse and more innumerable, seeing the exclusive Jewish economy inflate beyond the Arab economy, with Jewish settlements popping up and down the coastline and in other very fertile regions. After seeing over a decade and a half, over 15 years of no progress in their talks with the British The people took to the streets in demonstrations and protests and general strikes to display their frustration with the talks, with violence erupting in 1920, 1921 and 1929, each stronger than the one before. In 1930, regarding the Baroque uprising, the British appointed Shaw Commission found that the fundamental cause of the violence, without which, in our opinion, disturbances either would not have occurred or would have been little more than local riot, is the Arab feeling of animosity and hostility towards the Jews, consequent upon the disappointment of their political and national aspirations and fear for their economic future, as well as Arab fears of Jewish immigrants not only as a menace to their livelihood, but a possible overlord of the future. Dr. Hussein al-Khalidi writes in his memoirs of the idea that any commission or report that would be released and was seen as being favourable to the Arabs would be shot down by Zionist lobbying in London, where everyone could see the intimacy between the Zionist leaders and the British policymakers. The British continued to repress the largely peaceful protests across the country, but popular dissent continued well into the 1930s, with these meetings and congresses taking place in secret, as the British would act very severely and strictly break up these meetings. Jewish migration stalled during the time of the Great Depression, as the outflow of Jews seemed to outpace the new arrivals, leading to the percentage stagnating between 1926 and 1932 from 17% to 18.5%. In 1936, a 6-month-long general strike was observed after 15 years of white papers, commissions, and reports issued by the government in London, with each being just as actionless as the last, and was seen as just another form of trying to buy more time. The Peel Commission proposed splitting the land and giving 21% to form a new Jewish state, and in it expelling a further 200,000 Palestinians from their homeland, yet further attempts or plans of ethnic cleansing. The indigenous population was further oppressed when the British crushed the 1936-39 Arab Revolt, of which 10% of the Arab male population was killed, wounded, imprisoned, or exiled. The British had deployed over 100,000 troops in Mandate Palestine at that point, more than they had done for all of India. It took the entire might of the British Empire, with further troops being relocated from other colonies to crush the rebellion, having placed 1 soldier for every 4 adults in Palestine, a ratio unlike any other before, with tactics used after being perfected for decades in Ireland, India, Kenya, and others. Whilst all this was happening, Zionist paramilitary troops such as the Irgun, Haganah, and later on Lehigh would be getting supplies of weapons from the British, as well as extensive training. They were also enlisted as the Jewish Brigade of the British Army in 1944, granting them valuable experience, transforming them from ragtag militants virtually to an official military wing, which would be the backbone of the Israeli Defense Force when the state would be founded, with further military support being added on from the 2 new post-war superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. All of this yet, and the Palestinian resistance would see considerable strides, with weapon imports through Syria largely bolstering the revolution. Rebels were exiled, killed, and tortured many times over. However, due to the outbreak of the Second World War in 1939 and the banning of weapon exports by the French due to its allyship with the British, the resistance faced further setbacks. The Jewish population would continue to rise from 6% in 1900 to 18% in 1932 to 31% in 1939 in Palestine. As another world war was being seen as yet another inevitability, it became clear that this war would yet again be additionally played out on Arab soil like the first, leading the British to shift their tactics and try and save face in front of the Arabs by giving them more concessions. The 1939 Cabinet Report stressed the importance of winning over neighbouring Arab countries like Egypt and the rest, with Secretary of State for India, Lauren Dundas, stressing that Palestine was no longer being seen as an Arab problem, but a pan-Islamic problem, and warned of serious trouble in India should they not act soon and decisively. The failures of the 1939 conference held in St. James Palace between the Palestinians, Zionists, and other Arab state delegates led to the British issuing a white paper in efforts of trying to win back the support of the Arabs and Indian Muslims, finally agreeing to the limiting of Jewish migration and land sales, promising representative institutions in 5 years and self-determination, aka independence, in 10. However, these final 2 promises were made contingent on the approval of all parties, including the Zionist militias, of which they would never allow, and the only measure that was ever actually implemented would be the limiting of migration. The limiting of Jewish migration came at a very bad time for the Jews of Europe, and especially Germany, with the rise of Hitler and the increasing hostility to the Jewish population in Germany, and soon to be the provinces in Eastern Europe and occupied France. The Jewish death tolls began to climb the labour and death camps. During this time, Jewish refugees were arriving at the doors of other countries like Britain, Canada, and America, but thousands of passengers were frequently turned away, such as the MS St. Louis in 1939, which attempted to board Cuba, then an American satellite state, and then Florida, before getting rejected and returning back to Europe. A third of the 300 passengers on board were murdered. Jewish anger, over the limiting of migration from Europe at its most dire was characterized in increasing hostility from the Jewish militias to the British. The same troops that had spent years being armed, trained, and in some cases even being utilized in operations and battles were now being used to launch attacks and bombings on the British troops which funded them. This culminated in the bombing of the British headquarters of the British Mandate, the King David Hotel, leading to the deaths of 91 people by the Irgun, which was the catalyst for the British withdrawal from Mandate Palestine. If I were an Arab leader, I would never sign an agreement with Israel. This is normal. We have taken their country. It is true God promised it to us. But how could that interest them? Our God is not theirs. There has been anti-Semitism, the Nazis, Hitler, Auschwitz. But was that their fault? They can see but one thing, that we have come and we have stolen their country. Why would they accept that? David Ben Gurion. In 1942, with the emergence of the United States and the USSR as the two main global powers overseeing international diplomacy, the Biltmore program, named after the hotel it was set up in, would be created, calling for the first time all of what was known as historic Palestine to be turned into a Jewish state, despite still having a 2/3 majority Arab population of different religions. Setting itself up in New York City, the city with the largest Jewish population in the world, and ongoing a PR campaign the likes the Palestinians were never able to match, along with the horrors of the Holocaust, pushed the Zionist narrative very firmly in the zeitgeist of American politics, leading to the biggest achievement yet, the official endorsement of a Jewish state by President Harry Truman. I am sorry, gentlemen, Truman said, but I have to answer to hundreds of thousands who are anxious for the success of Zionism. I do not have hundreds of thousands of Arabs amongst my constituents. The Anglo-American Committee of Inquiry in 1946 sought to relocate some 100,000 Jewish Holocaust survivors. However, neither America nor Britain actually wanted to take them in, leading them to push these refugees into Palestine, negating their promise in the 1939 White Paper, all while still not having any official representative body to that day. The Soviet Union also sought to bring Israel onto its smaller list of allies, hoping to see it turn into a Middle Eastern socialist state and a new ally. It was quite rare to ever see those two sides of America and the Soviets come together and support one country, but they supported its establishment and provided military arms and financial support, as well as diplomatic backing. Despite the reasons the Soviets had backed Israel was their ambition to have a socialist republic in the Middle East, with Israel purchasing stockpiles of weapons off of the Soviet Union via Czechoslovakia during the ceasefire of 1948. Much to their eventual disappointment, relations soured when Israel started cozying up to the old colonial powers, Britain and France, and stood against one of the Soviets' new allies in the region, Egypt. The Arabs, meanwhile, had diverging interests. Both Egypt and Saudi Arabia were looking to increase their influence in the Arab world and had the move for Pan-Arabism. Therefore, both ended up more or less turning a blind eye to the events unfolding in Palestine. The 1948 partition, both in principle and in substance, can only be regarded as an anti-Arab solution. United Nations Special Commission on Palestine Minority Report. Starting from November of 1947 up until the establishment of the State of Israel in May of 1948, Zionist paramilitary troops from the Haganah, Lehi, and Irgun would go from town to town in efforts to depopulate the major western urban centers, namely Jaffa and Haifa, as well as many parts of West Jerusalem and many other smaller towns and villages. An ethnic cleansing plan dated before the official Nakba, called Plan Dalet.
There is Palestinian rejection of the partition plan. There are even Palestinian actions against the partition plan. Attacks on Jewish transport, attacks on Jewish settlements, demonstrations, petition, although they peter out. There's a very interesting remark by one of Ben Gurion's advisors who says they peter out too quickly. We need them to show more resistance in a way. They're sort of worried about it. And why were they worried? And that's the second thing that happens. Suddenly they see something which will become part of the Israeli DNA. If you want to feel good with something bad you do to the Palestinians, you need a pretext. And the Palestinians at first provided the pretext. They attacked the Jewish settlement. They murdered a Jewish bypasser. So you can retaliate. And at first the retaliation is not ethnic cleansing. It's tit for tat. But then two things happen. The Palestinian resistance peters out. There's not much to react against or retaliate. And secondly, you suddenly see that what is described as retaliation becomes more orientated towards chasing people out of their villages. But it takes a while, and I describe it in my book, The Ethnic Cleansing in Palestine. It takes a year for it to gel as a strategy. By February 1948, it's already a strategy, and then it makes its way into what is called Plan D on the 10th of March 1948, and more importantly, it makes its way to what is called the orders of Plan D, or Status B, Matzav Dalet, which is thousands and thousands of orders that were sent to the people, to the troops on the field.
In his memoirs, which were censored by the Israeli military but leaked to the New York Times in 1979, the late Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin recalled the conversation he had in July 1948 with Ben Gurion, when Rabin was an officer in the Israeli army, regarding the fate of more than 50,000 Palestinian residents of the cities of Lidda and Ramle. Rabin wrote, "We walked outside. Ben Gurion accompanied us. Yigal Allon repeated his question, 'What is to be done with the Palestinian population?' Ben Gurion waved his hand in a gesture which said, 'Drive them out.' Rabin added, 'I agreed that it was essential to drive the inhabitants out.'" On a side note, if you feel like this has been helpful or educational, don't forget to subscribe.
There is Palestinian rejection of the partition plan. There are even Palestinian actions against the partition plan. Attacks on Jewish transport, attacks on Jewish settlements, demonstrations, petition, although they peter out. There's a very interesting remark by one of Ben Gurion's advisors who says they peter out too quickly. We need them to show more resistance in a way. They're sort of worried about it. And why were they worried? And that's the second thing that happens. Suddenly they see something which will become part of the Israeli DNA. If you want to feel good with something bad you do to the Palestinians, you need a pretext. And the Palestinians at first provided the pretext. They attacked the Jewish settlement. They murdered a Jewish bypasser. So you can retaliate. And at first the retaliation is not ethnic cleansing. It's tit for tat. But then two things happen. The Palestinian resistance peters out. There's not much to react against or retaliate. And secondly, you suddenly see that what is described as retaliation becomes more orientated towards chasing people out of their villages. But it takes a while, and I describe it in my book, The Ethnic Cleansing in Palestine. It takes a year for it to gel as a strategy. By February 1948, it's already a strategy, and then it makes its way into what is called Plan D on the 10th of March 1948, and more importantly, it makes its way to what is called the orders of Plan D, or Status B, Matzav Dalet, which is thousands and thousands of orders that were sent to the people, to the troops on the field. So that's kind of a trajectory.
And those orders themselves are documented.
They are documents. Again, we have many of them. We don't all of them. We have enough.
Tens of other villages and towns received the same treatment, leading to tens of thousands of indigenous Arabs being ethnically cleansed off of their land and turned into refugees weekly. The Zionist militias relied on violent stories being spread about the atrocities in order to fuel the propaganda machine, with the Deir Yassin massacre being used as fear bait to scare the Arabs away. In that village, just overlooking Jerusalem, 100 of its residents were massacred in fighting overnight, 2/3 of them women, children, and the elderly, despite the village of Deir Yassin setting up a peace treaty with the local Jewish settlements. The head office of the British police force, just 3 kilometers away, responded with, "It is none of our business," when notified of the massacre. The story of Deir Yassin, along with many other towns, were used as propaganda by the Zionist militias, with stories about women being raped and babies being killed circulating, all in an effort to scare the population out of their towns.
השתוללו בטנטורה, זה היה משהו נורא. טנטורה היה כפר עשיר, בתים יפים, גרים כמו אירופאים, אתה יודע, וגם אנשים היו לבושות ויפה, וזה באמת היה כפר... אחד אנס שם איזה ילדה בת 16, משהו כזה, אתה מבין? אבל זה מכוער מאוד, היה לנו בחור אחד, הוא נפטר, הוא היה פרא אדם, הוא לקח פשוט מאוד, ורצח אותם בתוך המכלאות. בתוך המכלאות, הם היו במכלאות, אתה יודע, חוטי ברזל כאלה, עגולים כאלה, אספו כל הגברים. הם יושבים שם, כולם, על הרצפה, ובא מישהו ולוקח תת מקלע ומתחיל שלקחו את הלוויורים ורדפו אחרי חבר'ה ושרפו אותם. זה היה משהו זוועתי, וזה אסור לספר, אני לא אדבר על זה, כי זה יכול להיות סקנדל שלם מהעניין הזה. אני לא רוצה לדבר על זה, וזהו. 3-4 חודשים הראשונים הייתי רוצח.
מה זה אומר?
אני לא לקחתי שבויים. בזמן קרב, אם מישהו ירים ידיים, משהו כזה, לא לקחתי שבויים. זה זעזע אותי עד כדי כך, לא יכלתי לעבור לסדר היום. אם היה עומדת כיתה של זה עם ידיים למעלה, אז באותו יום הייתי רואה אותי, הייתי קוצר את כולם, עד כדי כך.
כמה אתה חושב אנשים הרגת ככה?
לא ספרתי. אני לא יכול לדעת בחיי. היה לי מקלע עם 250 כדורים. ותראה, יריתי, נלחמתי כולם. אני לא יכול לספור.
In the cities of Lod and Ramla, Jordanian troops just pulled out of the city after a secret deal between the king and the Jewish state. The militants entered the city and massacred the people. 100 people were massacred in the Dehmash mosque alone. 50,000 people were expelled from these two cities. Many died from the heat in what would be called the Lidda Death March. On February the 15th, 1948, Zionist militias stormed the town of Caesarea near Haifa and torched it to the ground, expelling its 1,000 inhabitants. The Zionist militants went from town to town doing much of the same, testing their methods all under the eyes of the British soldiers that were still there. Jaffa was sieged, bombed and attacked mercilessly until the city's 60,000 Arab inhabitants were forced out. No country came to put an end to this clear international legal violation, as Jaffa was well within the original partitioned Palestinian state, a theme the Arabs were soon to get accustomed to, despite the fact that Jaffa was laid out in the UN partition plan as being part of the Arab state.
Right. So my understanding is that one point of contention, even within the new historian cadre, is the interpretation of Plan Dalet, right? Of whether it says this is how we're going to defend the nation state against the incoming Arab armies, and to do so we have to make sure that we don't have a fifth column at our rear, versus, aha, now is our chance, this is how we're going to expel the Palestinian population. So
what can you do? I think Plan D is straightforward. It's straightforward. It says the Palestinian villages and towns have two options, either to surrender or to be kicked out. And then comes the question, why did people who surrender also were kicked out?
But were they all kicked out?
Not all, but many of them. Many of them. We will come back to the question why they did not kicked out. But all of the Palestinians in Haifa were kicked out. All the Palestinians of Jaffa were kicked out. All the Palestinians, all urban Palestine was ethnically cleansed by the 1st of May 1948. And this was a direct implementation of Plan D. I think part of the bone of contention is that people focus on the document that they have, which is called Plan D, which was the political document. What I did, I said Plan D is not just this document, which said, you know, as you say, we will defend ourselves against invading Arab armies, and we are just talking about the area which is between us and the Arab armies, and there we'll do that and that. But if you look at what I call Matzav Dalet, the orders that were given to the brigades, and the brigades to the battalions and the companies.
And these weren't just spoken orders, these were written orders.
No, these are written documents. You can see that the same method that Plan D suggests for applying to the villages and towns in what was called Retzuat HaBitachon, in this security zone, are applied to every village and neighborhood in Palestine.
Every village and neighborhood.
Every village and neighborhood. In fact, you could easily say that it is very interesting. The one brigade I really looked at, really focused, is the Alexandroni Brigade, where I really could find the orders. It does say in the end of every order, it says basically what to do with the population after you occupy the village or the neighborhood is up to you. This appeared in every, basically it's up to you. I interviewed a lot of officers and so on. They said, we understood that as kick them out. Some of them, it's true, some of them, in few cases, decided to let them be. It's true.
So there was some variegation,
A variegation,
heterogeneity.
but people understood what was to be done.
So the understanding was it was a wink-wink situation, or it was we'll leave this to your discretion?
No
period.
ethnic cleansing operation in the history is, as you can see in the ethnic cleansing operation, ethnic cleansing definition, the State Department definition. Even in the worst case of ethnic cleansing, which we had in the 1990s in Serbia, there were no direct orders like that. You create an atmosphere, the soldiers know what they have to do. That's why oral history is as important as the documents. You know, every Israeli trooper I interviewed said to me, come on, are you joking? We knew what we had to do. You can see, by the way, you go to the Zochrot website, they have 30 to 50 interviews with Israeli soldiers from 48 who say to the camera, we knew exactly what was expected of us.
Plan Dalet called for the destruction of villages as much as possible during military operations. In each attack, a decisive blow should be struck, resulting in the destruction of homes and the expulsion of the population. Destruction of villages, setting fire to, blowing up, and planting mines in debris, especially those population centers which are difficult to control continuously.
It happened many times that the Israeli soldiers took 10 of the youngsters in the middle of the village, shot them just in order to kill them, in order that all the others will see it and run away. And if it's not enough, they took others also.
The Palestinians left of their own accord and in the expectation of a triumphal return. Another variant of this version is that the Palestinians left on order from their leaders to clear the decks for the invading Arab armies, and they were promised that after the great Arab victory, they will be able to return to their homes. So that is the traditional Zionist version, and it's completely untrue. And there is a massive amount of hard evidence to contradict this version.
Half of the Palestinians who became refugees were already expelled from their houses by May 1948. So why I could say that out of the 530 Palestinian villages that were destroyed in the 1948 Nakba, half of these villages were already demolished by the 15th of May.
With the British withdrawal of Mandate Palestine following the severe tension and backlash from both the Jews and the Arabs, they turned around to the newly formed United Nations and authorized them the partition of Mandate Palestine between an Israeli and a Palestinian state. The UN partition plan of 1947 gave 56% of the land, and often the most fertile and desirable, to the Jewish state, and just 43% to the Palestinians, despite the fact that there were more than twice as many Palestinians than Jews. Jerusalem was to be turned into an internationally administered zone. The Israelis, happy with the initial map, accepted the deal and officially declared the State of Israel on May 14, 1948, as the 15th, which was when the British had planned to leave, was the Sabbath. The British had essentially built up the State of Israel for them over the past 30 years, and there was no difference in life on the ground between the end of the mandate and the establishment of the State of Israel, for Jewish citizens, that is.
ورثوا نظام الدولة الإنجليزي. عندما أعلنوا الاستقلال لم يهدموا البنى القائمة، أخذوها كما هي. يعني في واقعية وبراغماتية رهيبة عند القيادة الصهيونية الأولى بقيادة بن غوريون. يعني بنية الدولة تؤخذ من الانتداب من الجيش للأمن لا كما هي، ثم يبدأون بصهيونتها.
لبيب في يوم 15/5 أي ثاني يوم بعد ما أعلن الدولة أذهب إلى مكتبي إذا كنت أشتغل في دائرة الصحة وأجد كل السجلات موجودة وكل الأعمال موجودة ومكتبي كما هو ناقصا شيئا واحدا فقط، وهو أن زميلي الفلسطيني، ولذلك أنا بقول أنهم استلموا إسرائيل instant state، دولة جاهزة ناقصا أهلها الطبيعيين.
With the declaration of the State of Israel and the expulsion of those refugees, the Arab states declared war on Israel. Despite the rhetoric that the Jews were being outnumbered and outgunned, defending themselves as the little guy against a coalition of strongly armed and trained functioning states.
That day, the New York Times ran the headline, "Jews in grave danger in all Muslim lands."
I've come back to the United States to tell Jews in the United States how the State of Israel has been formed. The Jews are holding their ground in the country in spite of the fact that they have been outnumbered by the Arabs, and the Arabs have come much better equipped with heavy arms than the Jews have in their possession. The reason is a simple one. Jews who are fighting in Palestine, the state of Israel, are fighting for the only thing that they have in their possession. It means life or death to them.
This rhetoric was false.
The Jewish forces in 1947-48, I mean, they were far stronger, even far more numerous, actually, than the combined Arab armies. They were a highly prepared, highly dedicated, well-armed fighting force, which was superior to all the Arab armies combined, except perhaps one army, the one army which they didn't really take on, and they made a deal with, really, talking about the Jordanian army.
في الحقيقة الجيوش العربية السبعة التي دخلت فلسطين في البداية لم تكن يزيد مجموع أعدادها عن 24,000 جندي، وهذه مأساة أن كل الجيوش العربية التي شاركت لم تكن لتصل إلا لثلث أعداد اليهود العسكريين المدربين المستعدين للقتال.
الجيوش العربية لم تكن معدة، لم تكن مستعدة، لم تكن منظمة، لم يكن هنالك القيادة الموحدة بقيادة الملك عبد الله، كانت تعمل في جانب والآخرين يعملوا بجانب آخر. الجيش العراقي يتلقى تعليماته من بغداد.
Was in fact one of the most bitterly divided, disorganized and ramshackle coalitions in the history of modern warfare.
الحركات الصهيونية في منظمة الصهيونية تلك الفترة كانت تملك قرارها، العرب لم يكن يملك قرارها. الحركة الصهيونية في تلك الفترة كان عندها أسلحة متطورة جدا وعندها مصانع سلاح في فلسطين، نحن لم يكن لدينا شيء من هذا. الحركة الصهيونية والمنظمة الصهيونية في تلك الفترة كان عندها امتداد عالمي، كانت أمريكا تقف إلى جوار، كان حتى السوفيت يقف إلى جوارها، وما كانت بريطانيا وكل العالم، نحن لم يكن يقف إلى جوارنا. يعني بكل المقاييس كانت المعركة تسير في صالح البطل.
The Arab states could only conjure up a force of 24,000 Arab soldiers across all 7 armies, 1/3 of the Jewish number, which was ever increasing due to conscripts from across Europe and America. They were also far more organized and effective. As earlier mentioned, they had been trained by the British and fought alongside them in skirmishes for decades and even gained extensive experience fighting in the Second World War, and were armed by the British, the Soviets and the Americans.
The British had not allowed forces from neighbouring Arab countries to enter Palestine until after their departure. By May the 15th, with the last British troops gone, Arab armies entered the country from the borders of Lebanon, Egypt and what was then called Transjordan.
After the 7 Arab states, just 5 had declared war on Israel in the wake of the Nakba, as more and more Palestinian refugees started pouring to neighbouring states. Yemen and Saudi Arabia did not yet have a capable and modern military force to speak of. From those 5, only 4 ended up crossing outside of their borders, with a small Lebanese army remaining put. The Iraqi and Jordanian militaries were ordered by the British not to cross over the Jewish state's borders, and were therefore unable to plot an invasion of neighbouring Israel. Known by the summer of 1949, the Palestinian polity had been devastated and most of its society uprooted. Some 80% of the Arab population of the territory that at war's end became the new state of Israel had been forced from their homes and lost their lands and property. At least 750,000 of the 1.3 million Palestinians were made refugees thanks to this violent transformation. Israel controls 78% of the territory of former mandatory Palestine and now ruled over the 160,000 Palestinian Arabs who had been able to remain barely 20% of the pre-war population. Of the 160,000 Palestinians who still managed to stay on the land, but in the new state of Israel, they became citizens of the new state but lived under strict martial law and would be routinely subject to land seizures as the state continued its push for a Jewish majority. This expropriation of Arab land was handed over to Jewish settlers or placed under the jurisdiction of the National Jewish Fund, which stipulated that the land could only be used for the benefit of the Jewish people, and included the bulk of the nation's arable land. This was all legal under the new Jewish legal doctrine. Only 6% of all Palestinian land was Jewish-owned prior to 1948.
Just as per my example at the start of the video, no solution will be found unless Peter apologizes to Nick for his initial act of humiliation, which then cascaded into the actions further. No solution can be found for the Palestinians without a few key points, such as an apology and acknowledgement over the many decades of persecution faced under the British and Jewish rule, the Nakba itself and the expulsion of 750,000 Palestinians and the massacring of 15,000. The requirement is also allowing the refugees that were expelled during the Nakba and their descendants to return to their land, and ending the apartheid system that has been called out by several human rights groups such as Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, and even an Israeli rights group, B'Tselem. A solution cannot be found between the two if these problems are not addressed and subsequently fixed. Rashid al-Khalidi is a New York-born Palestinian-American historian of the Middle East and Edward Said Professor of Modern Arab Studies at Columbia University. He also has a history of teaching at Georgetown University, the American University of Beirut, the University of Chicago, and the Lebanese University, and whose father worked for the United Nations. He graduated from Yale University and the University of Oxford and has published several critically acclaimed pieces, with his most famous being the 100 Years' War in Palestine, which goes into great depth with a lot of historical backing and legitimacy. This book was the basis of this video, with other texts, books, and articles being used. Khalidi's high education, background, career, and lineage add a lot of nuance and context into its history. But if, for some reason, you feel his perspective to be biased due to his background being Palestinian, I would also recommend Ilan Pappé's Ethnic History of Palestine, which talks much about the same. Ilan Pappé is a Jewish Israeli historian, which means that he was given access to highly secret documents that the Israeli government bans anyone but Jewish Israelis from accessing, as well as interviews with high-ranking officials. His books offer a very similar outcome from a unique perspective, with more documents being brought to light